ask questions for clarity or make comments, I will do my best to address them as long as they're on point with what we're talking about here. And if I don't feel like I can address it properly, then I won't. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about with regard to spirituality and mental health is something that I saw in a blog post. It was a chat forum about not bipolar, borderline personality disorder. It's also been called emotional intensity personality disorder. And it a person asked, it was a forum that was designed for people who don't have these issues to ask questions of people who do. And so somebody asked the question, what is it like to be borderline personality disorder? And the person wrote down, when that part of your personality comes out, your ego or your person becomes a life in service to the past, a life in service to the past. And it went on to explain why. And as I read it, I agreed with everything. I was like, wow, that I just never heard it put that way. That when you have strong emotional dysregulation because you are an inheritor of generational trauma, which is that you've inherited all the unresolved emotions that your parents, your grandparents, anybody in your lineage on both sides of your parents, that they were unable to resolve as children. It's mostly passed down as children before reproductive age. It ends up in their genetic material and it ends up in that person. And that person then is at more risk for having children who have emotional dysregulation conditions as a feature, their mental health, like ADHD, autism, bipolar, schizophrenia, PTSD, things like that. And then you combine that with possible traumatic experiences, then the person becomes really emotionally dysregulated. And so when you have a brain that's automatically set up for this through generational trauma, that means you already have an emotionally edgy nervous system, very sensitive nervous system. You can be very emotional to things. Sometimes people, you look like you have emotional reactions that are way beyond what the situation calls for. And it's so strong in your body. You like pulling a lot of drama to yourself. You'd like people to help you solve these problems. Basically, you are in this strong sense of panicky emotional suffering, like several times throughout the day when you have these emotional dysregulation conditions. And that can easily lead to being diagnosed with a personality disorder, like borderline personality disorder. And so when this person wrote down, it's a life in service to the past, I really agreed with that. And so in my own mental health and dealings with generational trauma as an inheritor of generational trauma, I could say that when that part of me would come out, that part of my personality would come out under stress, I would start talking to my then wife, but now my ex, because she got sick of me talking like this, like I was always trying to make up for some kind of wrong that had happened in the past. And so my head, when I got stressed out, would always try to justify the emotions, the oversensitive emotions, the anger and the self-righteous justification with this story. Like this reminds me of my mother, or this happened to me when I was in school when I was a kid, and so it's just not right. And I would get really intense as if the trauma just happened. It had happened maybe when I was 12 years old. And here I was speaking to her in my 30s, 40s, talking like it was because it was unresolved. It was never really resolved. And so this person in the blog post wrote, when you're like that, you get into arguments, all of a sudden it's like your ego is trying to right some kind of wrong that happened to them in the past and is really emotionally intense about it to the point where you cannot see the current situation. You cannot see that your ex or your wife or your partner's, you know, is an innocent person in all this and is just getting this whole thing unleashed upon them. And when so I was diagnosed with mild borderline, uh, because it really only unleashed it on one person. And it was to the point where when I would get stressed and I would talk just like that, just like the way the person talked about like that. I could watch it, but I couldn't control it. I couldn't stop it. So it was like, and I'm hearing this other person talk about borderline. It's like some other part of your person comes out, wrecks your relationship, and goes back inside, and you can't stop it. And so there are terms for it, like switching, dissociation. Let's just say, it happened so often that even though I knew it was destroying the relationship, I couldn't stop it. And I did my best to. And lots of us, people like us, we end up in addictions. We end up being addicted. One of the favorite things to be addicted to is marijuana and alcohol because we're constantly trying to sedate that part of our brain that's overly emotional all the time. And so it made sense when I read this because I would act that way when the person said that. Like you're trying to like make up for some kind of trauma that happened to you in your childhood or something like that that was never resolved, and now you cannot see that this person in front of you is not that person who traumatized you all the way back then. At least your emotional system cannot do it. Intellectually, you could say, is this person in front of you your mother? No. Well, then why are you acting that way? My emotional system couldn't tell the difference. And so it was constantly trying to right this kind of wrong, and it never did it. It was never able to do it because it wanted to do it through her. It wanted her, when I got that way and stressed out, it wanted her to say just the right thing, at just the right time. And the next week, that thing that I wanted her to say was different. And so I never knew really what that thing was when you get that way. It's really horrendous. It's a terrible way to live, really. Some people are writing this stuff here. How do you reconcile when you go through that? I wish I was able to reconcile it while I was in the marriage. I never realized what what the way to reconcile it was. Now I can, because that part of my ego got strongly resolved. And so I just want to talk a little bit more about it because the way this got reconciled is all about the meditations that I do. That's why I do them, because there are many people like myself, in my opinion, that are way to the one side of generational trauma. And their emotions are so severe, they have emotional reactions either inside or outside that are explosive or that they just keep them inside, but they're strong emotional reactions. Usually they have multiple mental health issues, including PTSD is always one of them. And if you get traumatized over and over and over in your childhood, you can easily end up with something called complex PTSD, which, people are aware of. It's very similar to borderline. It basically creates a personality that, when stressed out, is just riddled with PTSD all over the place. And that's a lot where that kind of self-righteous anger comes from. You're not just angry at a person, you're angry at God, at life. And that's one of the features of actually of complex PTSD. You feel like you got a raw deal in life. And so you're not just mad at a person, you're mad at God and stuff. So I was like that as well. And they're saying sometimes that complex PTSD is borderline. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. So as you could see, a person who's inheriting generational trauma is serving the past. They are resolving all the trauma that happened in their lineage. And we, just by feeling all of these emotions, in a way, are resolving them. Because the way you resolve a difficult emotion is emotions are an energy, just like any other, like an energy wave in the ocean. And so, how does energy in a wave in the ocean resolve itself? It goes up, it peaks, and then it goes down. So, it has to be allowed to get to its, peaking expression of itself. But when you have inherited the trauma, unresolved trauma of several generations, the volatility and strength and emotional intensity of that emotional peak is way beyond what, like, say, average waves. And so I've used this comparison before in the videos. If God is the ocean and all the billions of individuals are waves, individual waves in the ocean, We are the volatile waves that are close to the rock that crash upon the rocks and they're really volatile and they crash and all this spray comes out of it. That's us in terms of our dealing with these emotions and all. Why is that? I mean, think about it's just like a wave in the ocean. That wave in the ocean is the product of all the waves that came before it, and all that energy got passed into it, and now it's its job to resolve it, right? And thus it becomes very volatile, and that's us. And we are doing a really important job in our lineage and for humanity. Many of us were part of a family, right? And so lots of times people like us, there are people in our families that are more functional than us. They're not as emotional as us. Maybe they have better resilience to adversity than us. They can roll with the punches better. We get too impulsive, too emotional. We become addicted, and then we can't function. But because most of the generational trauma went into us, lots of times you could see a sibling who just doesn't have this problem. Or if they do, it's manageable compared to us. So you could say it's because life chose us to resolve it in, and not your brother, not your sister, or in my case, not my mother. And she had strong emotionality, but she had strong resilience to adversity, and she could function much better. She was able to hold down the same job, for 40, 50 years and retired. Fine. But she was very emotional and volatile when she came home in the house and stuff. So because she pushed it down, went into me. And so I'm not as functional, but I'm resolving the trauma that she couldn't. So think about that. Like no one asked you if you wanted to do this because the sacrifices you make as a result of being a person who's too emotional and overly impulsive and addicted. And lots of times that kind of stuff affects your executive functioning. We're not good with money. We're not good with time management. We're not good in relationships. And these are all important things to survive out there. We're not very functional at all. So we have to make these kinds of sacrifices that other people don't have to make. We go through jobs a lot. We go through relationships a lot. Lots of us get divorced. Lots of us get fired or we're just underemployed. A lot of us were really bad with money. And so we live in our parents' basements and stuff like that. So the kind of sacrifices that we make, we didn't ask for this. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And I also wanted to talk about other things that I noticed about it. No. So one, your life is in service to the past in terms of what you're resolving for your lineage. And then two, your life is in service to the past that it creates a stressed out personality that's always feeling like it got victimized in the past. And it did, probably, parental abuse, childhood abuse, maybe in high school, bullies, things like that. And so we usually get abused very, very easily and taken advantage of a lot. And so we do have a lot of traumas in our past that were unresolved in there, and they just keep on coming up in a very emotionally intense way because they weren't resolved. And so what I've also found, which is sort of interesting, I'm looking at some of the comments in here. Pastor said, "Have you forgiven God for the life you have?" That's a really interesting comment there. After these energies were reconciled, I realized that generational trauma was never actually a mistake or a problem. It was never, it was just it was just what happened and what needed to happen, and there is no blame. I don't blame my mother anymore. I could see what she was dealing with. How can the wave in an ocean blame the other wave before it? It's just carrying energy from the wave before that. It's sort of like that. It was bound to end up in somebody, and it ends up in us. There's no blame there because there's not really a problem. This is just the way human biology and human genetics is. All this unresolved trauma energy from childhood, because children have to push a lot of feelings down and trauma down to function and make it out there, it eventually gets purged out in that person's lineage through people like us. So this is the way it's supposed to be. And I should say this, everybody, I would say, is dealing with lots of forms of generational trauma. When they did studies of generational trauma in mice, the famous cherry blossom study that I talked about in the video on Sunday, they found that it took 13 generations of baby mice to work that trauma out. 13 generations. Okay, so I feel that a lot of people are just in various stages of resolving their family's lineage and stuff. So sometimes it's very little because a lot of it passed into their brother or sister, or sometimes they have generational trauma in them and maybe some mental health issues like anxiety or depression or ADHD, but they can function. Other times they're honestly functioning addicts like I was, so I was able to hold a job, have a marriage, stuff like that. But when I came home, I drank like a lot, and stuff because that was the way I was managing. I was using alcohol as a psych med. Or other times the generational trauma is so severe and you can end up with severe, like borderline personality disorder or emotionally intense personality disorder or something, and you just can't function. At the slightest sign of stress, your whole brain just breaks down and can't handle it. So this is people the weight of the one side of it. And another thing that I've also found I thought was interesting, and I wanted to talk about this with the generational trauma thing, is I found that so I did a lot of my own personal work, self-improvement work, therapy work before my daughter was born. She was born on average later in life compared to when people usually have kids. I was already in my 30s when she was born and all, and so I went through a good, geez, 12, 13 years of therapy, self-improvement work before she was even born. But I noticed whatever energies, emotions that you didn't resolve in yourself before your child was born, you can see it, that exact emotion in them that's unresolved. So here's a good example of all the work that I did, which was helpful and all. One thing that I never really resolved well was my low self-esteem, feeling bad about myself, feeling shame, feeling like I was a bad person. I was also raised Catholic, so it's constantly like being told you're a bad person. And so I never really resolved that well. But when we had our daughter and we did our utmost best to raise her in an environment that was nurturing, loving, supporting. We made sure that she went to like Montessori Reggio Emilia schools. We made sure that we always talked to her in loving, nurturing, supportive language. But when she hit a certain age, like around 8, 9, 10 years old, when she would make a mistake or not do well on something, she would just go into this low self-esteem rant. I'm such a terrible person. I'm an idiot. And it got, so much these thoughts that would come out of her head. I'm such an idiot. I'm such a bad person. I'm so stupid. I would have to ask her, where did you get all this? Like, I don't, we've never called you this. We've never made you, we took great measures to make sure you were never talked to that way by us or teachers or anyone. And then I realized when I found out about generational trauma, I realized like it could have been that. I never really resolved that inside myself, and I could see it in her. You know, another thing was, she had strong anger at the entire one half of males. She had strong anger at males growing up, being a teenager. And yes, you could say it was from her experiences and what she was learning and things like that. But to me, it was like an anger that it was almost unfounded, like way beyond like, as a father, I tried to teach her, be very nurturing, loving, supportive, not like, I never berated her. I never touched her. I never, showed her a physical male, like getting mad at her or anything like that. But yet she had this strong anger. And I realized that my ex never really resolved the anger at her father before she was born. And so I could see it passed into her. And so you could sort of see it, what's sort of interesting. Sometimes I work with people and you could see that they have strong unresolved guilt that they never really resolved. Then they had a child, and then you could see the guilt play out in the child because they're in these kinds of stuck in these kinds of guilt-ridden relationships and stuff. So you can sort of see that the guilt passed from the parent into the child. They grow up and now they're dealing with the guilt by being in a strong guilt-ridden relationship. Something that makes them feel guilty all the time. So I just thought that was interesting to see that, whatever unresolved traumas that you had there, you could sort of see it enacted like directly. I thought that was just really interesting there. Um, and I should say that, the work that I do, and I might have said this before in a video, you know, the coaching protocol, all the videos that I do around this, the mental health, spirituality, generational trauma, in the end, they are made for people like me, people on the more severe end of being inheritors of generational trauma and lead these tumultuous lives because, we have to make so many sacrifices. And honestly, on average, we don't live as long as everybody else. We die from addictions. We die from stress-related medical issues because the stacked multiple mental health issues. We have a lot of executive functioning problems and we make really tragic mistakes while driving or in accidents around the house. And so we die from those. Or we die from suicide. And one of my good friends was an inheritor of generational trauma, but I didn't realize it because I didn't know about this. And only when I really investigated my own mental health and understood this thing with generational trauma did I realize that we were alike and we really related to each other. And we were very close at one time. And then she took her own life. And so I dedicated the work that I do in helping people for her and people like her, to maybe help them to survive that they are this purge and maybe to help ease their suffering. And so when you talk about how did you reconcile this, yeah. So you could say definitely it's about riding the wave of this. So there's a difference between having a body that's just neurologically, anatomically designed to be just more edgy, more anxious, more emotional. And so you can have this kind of explosive form of autism like I have. You can have, just generalized anxiety, like you can have a brain that's just much more edgy and anxious. And so you just have these, your brain just responds this way compared to the average. And every brain they're finding is like a thumbnail, a thumbprint. They're all different. So a person's sense of emotional reaction to a trigger, say like losing $50 or having your check engine light on your car go off, depending on the way your brain is, or worse, you have an argument with a spouse or something like that, the way your brain is, you'll either spike or it'll be very low. So everybody's, they're all in different kinds of this spectrum based on the way their body's designed. But what I found was, and I heard this from a spiritual teacher, and I totally agree with it. Your ego, your person. So your ego is basically your person. It's basically what you interact with, what you think with. You think like you're an individual in here. What's good for me? What's not good for me? You're on this call right now thinking this might be good for me. You also talk to people this way. I'm on this call or I bought this kind of food because I thought it would be good for me. Do you think it would be good for you? That kind of talking, that kind of thinking, that's your ego. That's your person. It's basically part of the survival mechanism of the brain as as the human species, the human animal, we are so evolved that our brain has created this thing called a person. This, all of these thoughts around this story of me that really believes I exist in here. This is the body, but inside it feels like there's a person in here. There's a sense of a person in here with these preferences, with this story. That's your ego. And so there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of times people think the ego is bad. It's not. It's you need an ego to interact with people. I don't know what really human beings would be, the human species would look like if nobody had an ego and they're walking around like organic flesh robots. I really don't know what that would look like. This is how we interact. Different personalities are different, right? However, what the ego also does is it's the carrier of all this unresolved emotion. And so if you're carrying a lot of generational trauma, or you have your own unresolved emotions and traumas in there from your past, it's your ego that stockpiles all of this unresolved emotion, almost like a backpack. And lots of times when people have things called ego deaths, where this energy is released, they'll describe it like that. It feels like I was walking around with this extra 50 pounds of weight called my ego. And it really does feel like it's heavy in there. And so when it's released, the person says, I just feel lighter. Sometimes people actually lose weight but usually they say, oh, I just feel lighter and stuff. And so the work that's in these meditations and the meditations that I do are designed not to change the hardware, the way your brain was genetically designed and all of the edgy nervous system and the clinical anxiety and the ADHD and autism. Those are all, you know, the way your brain was genetically designed. It's not designed to take away that. It's designed to release or dissolve, I guess, or integrate. There's many different words for it. I call it integrate, just uh, allow all of those unresolved emotions to peak in a very safe, loving, as nurturing and peaceful way as possible. That's why all the meditations are designed to basically release all of this extra unresolved emotion and trauma that the ego is holding and carrying. And it really is just an emotional release that needs to take place. You don't need to, you can talk to your ego about it and try to do it through traditional talking, like talk coaching and stuff like that. I found it so much quicker, more effective, and abiding when you just go around the ego's thinking and just go right for the emotion and release it energetically that way, which is why my meditations are designed that way. It's designed, if you notice, I always say, don't go with the mind because it just complicates things. The mind it will actually hold on to an emotion rather than release it. And it's always trying to analyze and think things through. I just go around it. There's no need. What I found is you don't need to keep talking to yourself in egos and try to convince your ego inside to release this energy. And you don't need to do that. You just need to realize what's going on, and then you can go around and go right for the emotion, which is what these meditation protocols do. So that's how you reconcile this. That's how you ride this wave out. You basically sort of, like you could say, take the wind out of the sails of the ego that's holding on to all this extra unresolved emotional baggage, either from your own past or from generational trauma. Okay, and that's what I found. So first this happened to me, and then I made a coaching protocol out of it, and I worked on it with others, and that's what they report. Okay. And so that's why I do all the meditations the way I do. Now, I should say, like I said, I should say certain things is, when I work with somebody individually, I always try to make sure that they feel safe. You have to feel safe in order to do this because it's really effective when you put aside all doubt, skepticism, the defensiveness of your ego to the side momentarily. It's much more effective when you're able to go deep into your emotions. And so you have to feel safe doing this. You know, um, a lot of times people have to talk to me first or meet with me, for a while before they feel safe enough to do that. And that's why I have all the videos up there, is because, it helps you to see like, I'm well intending. I'm not here to hurt anybody. I'm trying to help people out like my friend, and so feeling safe is one. Um, just be aware if you have yourself your own mental health diagnosis because certain things will still stay there. If you just, like I said, if you have an edgy nervous system, it'll still be there. If your body's just designed to feel a lot of emotion and generational trauma, like, so even though the ego here, a lot of the unresolved core emotions were resolved, the generational trauma that this body is dealing with, I feel, is all about family loss because my mother was a child in World War II and lost several family members that she would see as a child died in front of her. And so and she had to push all this emotion down. She never really grieved it. I could see it in her. She's still alive. And so, and then to me, all this unresolved family loss. Same with her mother. I mean, I can only imagine, you know, the, her mother lost children who died in front of her. And so this is passed along family loss. And so what this body, even though there's a lot of resolved, integrated core emotions that makes this ego much more manageable, much lighter, it is still dealing with strong, unresolved emotional loss in my lineage. And that's lots of times why, if God or the universe is trying to work out a certain energy, like family loss, this is what I've found. So in my lineage, I feel the generational trauma energy that's being worked out is family loss. Now it gets to me. Your story has to have family loss in it in order to bring that out. And that's what happened here. The feeling of loss that came out in the divorce, my own divorce, when my 25-year marriage ended, was titanic. I was even thinking to myself, this is way too much grief and loss just for one. This is insane. And that's lasting for so long. But then when I learned about generational trauma, it made sense. If my mother and her mother never resolved family loss from the death of loved ones, my story would have to have family loss in it in order to bring it out. And that's why lots of times these stories are tragedies in us. If you look at them, they're designed to tap into that emotion, like loss. So you're going to have loss in your life. If God or universal energy is wanting to work out the unresolved trauma of family loss, you're going to have situations in which you feel a lot of guilt in your life, maybe through a relationship. If in your lineage, your parents or grandparents never dealt with their guilt, just pushed it all down. Guilt's a really difficult emotion to feel because you feel bad about yourself. And so lots of times people push their guilt down, and so then it passes in their children. They can see that. So your story in the present, if you're dealing with a strong emotional lot like low self-esteem, loss, guilt, and then you look back on your lineage, you can usually see a connection there. Your story has to have the same emotion that was unresolved in your lineage, just so it can get resolved. That's why it's there and stuff. So this whole generational trauma paradigm doesn't take all of this stuff away. It doesn't take away the pain. That has to be resolved by feeling it. What it takes away is the misunderstanding. Like from this point of view, it all makes sense why we're like this. Otherwise, we just look like we're screw-ups in society who are just too impulsive and emotional and addicted. But when you look at it from this point of view, it actually makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And that's why lots of times I teach this stuff. You know, I mean, if I can help to save somebody's life who's down on themselves when they realize by telling them, you hold a very important job in your family without even realizing it. Your mind may think you're a screw up, but you hold a very important job when you look at it from the generational trauma paradigm.